Good afternoon. It is a pleasure to be back. This is the second episode. Once again, my name is Dr. Ron Lynch. And as you recall, a soon to be graduate from the University of Florida in the program of public health. In that last episode, we actually identified and defined public health. I have a particular interest in the environment. And in the last presentation, we talked about male infertility among farm workers. But today's program is the one you don't want to miss. And this has to do with pesticides and childhood cancers. And what a pitiful, sorrowful subject that children are unfortunate victims of cancer. And we're going to have a discussion. At my side today, we have Camille. Camille is also a graduate of the University of Florida. How are you doing today, Camille?
I am doing great. Thank you for having me again, Ron. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. And what we want to talk about today is the fact that children are exposed to potentially cancer-causing pesticides. And unfortunately, that is related to an association with various childhood cancers. And we're going to get right into that subject matter today. I'm fortunate that I don't have any direct relatives or direct friends that have suffered in this kind of way. What about you, Camille? Is this anything that has hit in your family line or in your close friendships?
I can't say that it has affected me directly. However, I am interested in learning more about how it affects people in general.
Okay. Well, children, they do come into contact with harmful substances through multiple sources. Children can come in contact with agricultural application, maybe through contaminated food and water, household pet control, or parental occupational exposure. So I've said a mouthful. The agricultural application, which theoretically would have been laid on the soil, we talked about last time, could potentially drift. It could become evaporated. It could then, if it vaporizes, it could then condense and come back down as rain. And more than children could be affected. But I think what we're going to find out is that children are more sensitive than adults in terms of the potential harm that can happen. So what are the malignancies or cancers that have been linked to pesticide exposure? Glad you asked. Leukemia is one. This is a cancer of the blood where there is poor regulation of how these cells reproduce, and so they may reproduce too much or too little. But as a result of this malformation, it can't be a good thing. So leukemia is going to be a very devastating impact on anyone's health. Neuroblastoma, you can perhaps get that root neuro and guess that it's involving what system?
The neurological system?
The neurologic system. And this blastoma has to do with the staging. So maybe in an early stage of neurological development, there are cells that would be arrested in that particular stage. There's also evidence of pesticide exposure in children with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And lymphoma has to do with the lymphatic system. And so if there is swelling, if a child had a swelling or a lump in the neck, that could be how it could be represented. Mm-hmm. So any of these situations are devastating to any parent having to go to one of these specialized institutions that we see advertised on television, like St. Jude's. And we're ultimately saying that children may be more sensitive to some of these carcinogenic effects of pesticide compared to adults. Now, before we get into any more information, does it seem counterintuitive that the number one killer of children in terms of a disease is actually cancer?
Yeah, I would say that's very shocking. Most people, when they think of cancer, they think of people that are older, their bodies breaking down, and that kind of. They think about older people in general. It's hard to associate leukemia with children, but it seems as though it's becoming more and more of an issue.
Yeah. And what I would think to myself is, if children are having this problem, would it be because they're somehow genetically inferior? You think, what would your intuitive guess be? Do you think that most of these pediatric cancers are because these children just have bad genes?
No, I would guess that their system isn't maybe ready to fight off maybe some of these chemicals. Maybe their body isn't able to fend for itself at such a young age.
Yeah, well, in fact, what studies have shown is that maybe somewhere between 5 to 15% of these childhood cancers could be ascribed to some genetic problem or some congenital problem. And so if it's not genetic, then we'd have to assume that the rest would be environmental.
Mm-hmm.
And so that means that it is potentially preventable. So a question may come up, do children working on farms have higher incidences of malignancies than the general public? So as it turns out, children working on farms are potentially at a greater risk for developing certain malignancies compared to their non-farm working peers. And evidence suggests that a connection between exposure to agricultural pesticides and an increased incidence of various cancers, and we talked about the leukemia, but brain cancer or soft tissue sarcomas is also on the table. So studies indicate that elevated risks are associated with parental pesticide exposure, particularly among children of farmers. So this means that the children seem to have a higher chance of developing the problem if their parents are also in the business.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we made some allusion last time that parents may bring home the clothing. They may bring home dust that may also be spread inadvertently around children. If they're wearing shoes and they wear those shoes into the house, if they're not washing their hands, these are all ways that some contact can actually happen.
I'm wondering, do you think some of the exposure to the chemicals, if it's cumulative, so if the repeated exposure or just being exposed to it once might be enough?
Good question. And I think there would have to be some dependence on what type of product we're actually talking about. In other words,
right.
Depending upon the pesticide in question, there may in fact be a need to have more of a accumulation, but it would depend upon the type. So research has highlighted that specific cancers have been linked to agricultural practices, noting that children that are exposed to pesticides can experience higher risk ratios. So, for example, one report mentioned a 6-fold increase in the likelihood of testicular cancer among men who worked as farmers. Furthermore, certain cancers such as the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and leukemia have been notably associated with higher levels of pesticide exposure among children living in farming environments. Overall, though, the available data indicate that children from farming backgrounds may face a higher incidence of specific malignancies. And so it's essential to consider the limitations of some of the studies that we will likely have reviewed. And unfortunately, a lot of those studies have small sample sizes. And so when there are smaller sample sizes, we cannot always make conclusive statements of, we would say, causality, and still have to go back to the links and the associations and the correlations that lead us to think that there's something questionable. So I don't know. Is there a question that you would ask for me to elaborate on based upon what I've said so far, Camille?
Yeah, I'm actually thinking, if there are any specific measures that maybe can be implemented to reduce children's exposure to pesticides in the home and in garden?
Well, I'm really glad that you asked that question, and it's going to probably have to start with education of the parents and the caregivers about the non-chemical pest control solutions. Is there such a thing as any natural pest management? Have you used anything at home, or have you heard of any techniques or technologies that employ non-toxic pesticides?
Non-toxic pesticides, I would say, other than just I would use normal gloves as a precaution, so that it didn't actually touch any of my skin.
There are certain powders that I've seen used, almost looking like baking soda, that seem to be safe enough to use around children. I think it's called boric acid, actually. But I think that has to be researched. This is for use of pesticides in our homes. At this particular point, we may not be talking about the farm, but just in general, inside the home, we need to find the safest things possible. But when you identify the fact that a pesticide is actually designed to kill a bug, or the pesticide is designed to kill the bug's nervous system, or their blood system would be impacted. I know years back we used a drug called warfarin, which was a blood thinner, and how it would kill a rodent would by allowing that rodent to essentially bleed to death because of its blood thinning capabilities. And so we need to encourage safer use and take many of these measures to avoid younger children getting too close, because it can be something that they can put in the mouth because they picked it up. So we've got to be really cautious. But to go above and beyond what you've asked, if we have to use pesticides, we at least have to follow the instructions carefully and make sure that we're not overdoing it. I don't know about you, but as a kid growing up, sometimes if we did have a roach spray, there might be a tendency to overkill. It might just take a little drop.
Absolutely.
But
we want to see it suffer.
We want to make sure that there's no chance.
Yeah. But it's very true. We often forget that the pesticide itself doesn't know where the bug stops and we begin. So, kind of being in relationship with that chemical, it can spread to ourselves very easily.
Right, you're right. So we may also have to employ physical barriers. So we want to create physical barriers in gardens and yards or fences to limit children's exposure and access to treated areas right after pesticide application, and to establish designated play areas far away from those treated zones. Indoor pesticide controls. So there are certain indoor pest products that also have been associated with some really bad things. So parents really have an obligation to choose the very safest things possible. But
Yeah.
You know what? There's a certain conundrum. I don't like ants. I don't like bugs, but somehow we were sold a bill of goods that said that we just want to kill all bugs. And that has actually entered into the field of medicine where
Hmm.
if there's a bacteria, we
Oh, I
want we want to
see.
kill the bacteria until that bacteria is no more in sight. And actually what we found out, and I want you to comment about this, is that many of the penicillins and the tetracyclines and the cephalosporins, these are names of types of medicines, can kill good bacteria as well as bad bacteria. So, in order to maintain a ecological balance, maybe we do need some bugs. Maybe bugs play a role in keeping birds happy with what they need to consume. But what if the bugs have been contaminated
Hmm.
by pesticide and birds are eating the bugs?
Birds are eating the bugs. We're eating the food that grows in the soil that is contaminated with these bugs that are um, also have issues themselves. It's a cycle, and it's all connected.
Yeah, but I think we need a re-education about bugs and the realization that there are some healthy guys
Oh yeah,
that make up a good balance.
they play a crucial role in keeping the health of the soil. That's vital. They play a major role in that.
Mm-hmm. All right, so then we could get to cleaning practices. Regular cleaning of homes can help to reduce dust and residue from pesticides. Use damp cloths for dusting and vacuum floors surfaces frequently to remove potential pesticide residue. And of late, I have been using a fair amount of vinegar and find that that is a very safe way to clean, and I feel safe that we're not introducing any negatives into that equation. There's the question: in what ways can future research improve the assessment and understanding of the health impacts of pesticide exposure on children? And so, as we look at what's going on in the world of academic research, we've got to have studies that employ sophisticated exposure assessment techniques, similar to those used in certain epidemiological studies. And this includes the use of biologic measures of pesticides and their breakdown metabolites.
I see.
And that can offer more precise data on exposure levels compared to self reported measures. So we want to collect detailed information on how parents are using pesticides in agriculture, as well as environmental measures for pesticide residue. We want to focus on the timing of exposure. So research should evaluate pesticide exposure during critical developmental periods such as preconception, pregnancy, and early childhood. What impact, I wonder, could it be if a pregnant woman, even before she knew she was pregnant, but she was handling certain pesticides? I wonder if that would put her unborn baby at at risk.
Yeah, I mean that is a very good question. I My guess would be yes, but I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah, if the quantity was enough and the concentration was enough, and if it happened for a long enough duration of time,
Hmm.
there could be. During the process of organogenesis. What is
Yeah, what is
organogenesis?
organogenesis?
Organogenesis is the fact that when sperm and egg they come together, and this miracle of mitosis and meiosis, where the cells divide, and whereas it was two cells, now it's
I see.
it's 16 cells, and now it's 32 and 64, and on and on and on. And so as these cells develop, we're now forming the cardiovascular system, the neurologic system, the
Hmm.
renal or the kidney system. And if anything goes wrong, if there is introduction of anything during this period of org, organ formation,
Hmm.
you could imagine that things could go wrong.
Yeah, I mean, we just learned that kids have more sensitive systems in general, so it could be that they're affected, like the unborn child, before even the mother.
So it really begs that if you're planning a pregnancy, you should be very cautious about whatever it is that you're surrounded by. We typically say, mom, you shouldn't be exposed to alcohol or tobacco, but we should start to think more about the solvents and the chemicals right in the kitchen
Hmm.
or in the garage or even the cosmetics that we put on our bodies.
Absolutely.
And since we're talking about focus on timing and exposure, there has to be some consideration of genetic environmental interactions. So investigating the interplay between genetic predisposition and pesticide exposure could lead to a better understanding of why certain children are more susceptible to pesticide related health issues. And so there's a subject of genetic polymorphisms that might influence the breakdown or the detoxification of pesticides, as well as family history of cancer. And we need to do more longitudinal studies, more studies that will follow children from early life through adulthood to establish those causal relationships, so we can say that definitely caused that. So between pesticide exposure and health outcomes. And that's going to enable researchers to assess the long term effects of early life exposures. And of course, we've got special populations. The populations that we're dealing with today, populations like children of migrant farm workers, and those, so that's a targeted study group that we'll need to also include with some studies.
And we're studying them because they have, on average, the highest exposure,
Yes, they do.
which makes sense to approach learning about it
Right,
kind of
right.
from the epicenter.
So this is a really tough subject, and I'm wanting to just summarize it and bring this to a little conclusion. So what we're saying here is that children are exposed to potentially carcinogenic or cancer-causing pesticides from use in our homes, in schools, in other buildings, lawns, gardens, through food and contaminated drinking water, from agricultural application drift or overspray or off gassing, and from carry home exposure of parents who work in certain environments. They'll bring those clothes and those things right inside the household. Parental exposure during the child's gestation. So when mommy is pregnant, and even before preconception, or even preconception may also be an important time period where problems can come in. So malignancies or cancers that are linked to pesticides in many of the reports include leukemia, the neuroblastoma or brain cancers, Wilms tumor, that happens to be a tumor involving the kidney, soft tissue sarcoma or Ewing sarcoma, or the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. So this represents cancers of the brain, the colorectal area, the testicular cancers. And although a lot of the studies that have been done have been limited to non-specific pesticide exposure, and that's because they often come in mixtures, and they usually only involve small numbers of exposed subjects, the potential for some bias may come into the picture. And it's noteworthy that many of the reported increased risks are of greater magnitude than those observed in studies of pesticide exposed adults. So it clearly suggests that children may be particularly sensitive or more sensitive to cancer causing effects of pesticides. And in a sentence, I would say that the children's protective system, you mentioned this, the children's immune systems are not able to to mount a good fight because they haven't been fully developed yet.
Correct. They're more. They are more vulnerable.
More vulnerable. Thank you. So, future research should and must include improved exposure assessments, as we mentioned, evaluation of risk by age of exposure, and we've got to investigate better the genetic environmental interactions. And there is a potential to prevent at least some of these childhood cancers by reducing or eliminating pesticide exposure altogether. So this was just a brief look at the notion of children developing cancer, which is such a sad proposition. But it appears that if we can keep the children protected from things that are known to kill living things, that we will realize that children and newborns, they are very vulnerable. Let's go back to the word that you chose. They're a vulnerable population that public health has a responsibility to protect. I often think about the children in the womb. Those children in the womb, or those newborns in the womb, they don't have anyone to speak for them.
Yeah.
But what must it be like if in the womb they are surrounded by loads of poisons and toxins? And so I'm going to leave the audience with one last notion. And this comes from a study called the Body Burden Study. And what they found out, and this was found out about 20 years ago. When I say 20 years ago, this means like in the early 2000s or in the late 1990s, that the average baby is born with about 287 chemicals in their body on day one. The Environmental Working Group, the Red Cross, drew blood. It was $10,000 per baby, and they discovered that on day one there's definitely an overabundance of chemicals that ought not be in baby. Now, whether or not each and every one of those chemicals are having some harmful impact, I think we would be safe to say that the least that they had, the better. And most of those toxins, that burden, was coming through mother, through the placenta, all through much of my biologic understanding at school. We understood that the placenta would protect baby from toxins potentially in mom, but we found out that placenta is permeable, or it's open to contaminants that are in mom, and so they connect with baby. And so when you evaluate what are those 287 chemicals found in this body burden study, you find out that there are some very harmful chemicals, many of which are environmental, and some of which include endocrine disruptors, and of some of those it absolutely involves pesticides that would be found not just on a farm, but on our lawns and in our own homes. And so let's see if we can do a better job of finding the least toxic materials to deal with the bugs that quite frankly, we may need those bugs, and we may not do well to want to murder every single spider and every single...
Be more selective.
Yeah. But listen, I wanted to thank you again for your attention.
Yeah, absolutely. This has been very informative and very joyful.
I appreciate that, Camille. And we're going to say goodbye again to the Central Florida community and beyond. And may we also say we hope that the good force, will be with you this day. Thank you so much.